So take out your notes packet on quadratic formula, go to number 1, and you're going to be taking notes during this video in your notes packet. It says to solve each of the following equations using the quadratic formula. So what I did was I wrote the quadratic formula up on the right hand side. Also, the directions do say to write your answers in simplest radical form. So here we go. Before we even start, if we look at number 1, we need to get it in standard form. So we need it to be set equal to 0. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this 6x over here, and that's going to make that x squared minus 6x plus 2 equals 0. So now I'm in standard form with the highest power first, and then down to the constant last, and then set equal to 0. So remember that a is always the number that's in front of your x squared term. So the number that's in front of your x squared term is a 1. Then your b is going to be the number that's in front of your x term, and the number in front of your x term is negative 6. And then your c is going to be the constant term, the number that's by itself, which is a positive 2. So then what we do is we simply start by plugging in those numbers into the quadratic formula. So it says x equals negative b. Well, if we look, our b is negative 6, so if we negate a negative 6, we'll end up with a positive 6. Then we write plus or minus, then we put a big square root symbol, and then we're going to do b squared. So negative 6, that quantity squared, minus 4 times our a value, which is 1, times our c value, which is 2. And then that whole quantity is going to be over 2 times a. Well, our a value is 1. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to do a little bit of simplifying. So we have 6 plus or minus. All right, so underneath the square root we have negative 6 squared, and if we square that negative 6, we get 36. Minus, and then 4 times 1 times 2 is 8. And this entire thing is over 2. So then we have x equals 6 plus or minus the square root of, and then we do 36 minus 8, which is, 28, right? And that whole thing is over 2. Okay, now, what the directions tell us to do is to put this in simplest radical form. So I'm just going to bring it up over here, and we are going to break down that radical. So I have x equals 6 plus or minus, and that I know that the square root of 28 I can break into 4 times 7. And the reason why I chose 4 times 7 is because 4 is a perfect square, so I can take the square root of 4. So then I have, come on now, x equals 6 plus or minus the square root of 4, which is a 2, and 7 is not a perfect square, so I leave it underneath the square root and put this all over 2. Okay, now what I want you to notice, though, is that this 6, the 2, and the 2 have a common factor. So I can take these numbers and I can divide out a common factor of 2, which is what I'm going to do. So I have x equals 3 plus or minus. Now that's 1 radical 7. I don't need to write the 1, so I'm just going to write radical 7. And then the whole thing technically is over 1, but I don't need to write that either. So just kind of going back, if I'm dividing the previous step, everything by 2, this would become a 3, this will become a 1, and this will become a 1. But those 1s are not necessary to write. So in simplest radical form, this is our answer to the first question. All right, let's look at number 2. Again, you should be taking notes in your notes packet. Well, with this one, everything is in standard form. We have the highest power first. Everything is all on one side of the equal sign and set equal to 0. So we're going to just get moving. So here, we're just going to say that a is the number, remember, in front of the x squared term. B is the number that is next in front of the x term, which would be negative 4. And c is the number that's the constant by itself, which is negative 3. So x equals the formula says negative b, which means to negate b. Well, since our b is a negative 4, if we negate that, we end up with a positive 4. Plus or minus, then we do the big square root, and then it's b squared, so that's going to be negative 4, that quantity squared, minus 4 times a, which is 2, and c, which is negative 3. Alrighty, and then this whole thing is over 2 times a, which is 2. Alright, so let's do a little bit of simplifying here. We have 4 plus or minus. Now, negative 4, if I square that, is a positive 16. If we look down here, I have two negatives. I have minus 4 times 2 times negative 3. So those two negatives are going to make a positive, and then 4 times 2 times 3 will give us 24. Okay, and that whole thing is over 4. Let's go one extra step and simplify what's inside that square root, and we are going to get 40. And that whole thing is over 4. All right, so now what we're going to do is the directions say to put it in simplest radical form, so we're going to break down that 40. So let's go back up over here again, and we get x equals 4 plus or minus, and I know 40 is 4 times 10, and the reason why I'm choosing that, again, 4 is a perfect square. So, now let's put that all over 4. So then I have x equals 4 plus or minus the square root of 4, which is 2, radical 10, and that whole thing is over 4. All right, so let's look at this one. Now I notice that these three terms here, come on, there we go, they all have a common factor of 2, so I'm going to divide by 2. So this will be a 2, this will become a 1, and this will become a 2. Okay, so then just to make it look nice and pretty, we're going to have 2 plus or minus. Now, I don't need to write the 1 in front of the radical 10. You're more than welcome to, but it's not necessary. And then this whole thing is over 2. So in simplest radical form, that's our answer. So before we start number 6, the one thing that we do need to notice is this is not in standard form. So we want to go highest power to lowest. So I'm going to start by moving this 9x right in there. Okay, so that's going to give me 3x squared. And remember, when I move something from one side of the equal sign to the other, I change its sign. And then plus 6 equals 0. Now, at this stage, we kind of have two options here. So what I could do is, I noticed that everything on the left-hand side of the equal sign has a common factor of 3. So what I could do is divide out the 3. But what I do to the left side, I should do to the right side. What it does is it just makes the numbers that you're putting in for your quadratic formula a little smaller, so some people like that better. So if I do that, then I end up with x squared minus 3x plus 2 equals, and obviously 0 divided by 3 is 0. So there I go. So I know that my a is 1, my b is negative 3, let me put commas there, and my c is 2. Okay, so I'm just going to plug it into the quadratic formula. So x equals negative b. Well, since b is already negative, then negative b would be a positive. So that's going to be 3 plus or minus square root. All right, b squared. So b squared minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is 2. And this entire thing is over 2 times a, which is 1. All right, so then that gives me x equals 3 plus or minus square root. Negative 3, when I square that, is a positive 9 minus, and then 4 times 1 times 2 is 8. And that is all over 2. All right, let me bring this up over here. So then that's going to give me x equals 3 plus or minus 9 minus 8, which is the square root of 1, and that whole thing is over 2. Now, I know that the square root of 1 is just 1, so that'll be plus or minus a 1 over 2. And then it really, at this point, what I would probably like to do is just break these up. Okay, so x equals 3 plus 1 over 2, and then on the right-hand side, I'm going to do x equals 3 minus 1 over 2. So on the left, 3 plus 1 is 4, and 4 over 2 is 2. And then on the right, 3 minus 1 is 2, and then 2 over 2 is 1. So there are my solutions. Now, just to give you an alternative, and some people prefer to do this, some people wouldn't necessarily think to take out that 3. So you can write this down, or you can just kind of watch it and see what you prefer. Now, I would start it the same way. So I need to get this in standard form, so I am going to move that 9x over to the left. So that's going to give me, just like on the last slide, 3x squared minus 9x plus 6 equals 0. Now, some people here would not want to divide by 3, so that's fine. So then in that case, my a is 3, my b is negative 9, and my c would be positive 6. All right, so let's start it. So x equals negative b. So again, my b is already negative, so a negative b would make that a positive 9, plus or minus big square root. All right, b squared, so that's going to be negative 9, that quantity squared, minus 4 times 3 times 6. So you can see that your numbers are a lot bigger, and some people don't like that. Okay, and that's over 2 times a, which is 3. All right, so let's work this out. So I've got 9 plus or minus, I'm going to have 81 minus 72, and that whole entire thing is over 6. All right, which gives me x equals 9 plus or minus the square root of 9, that whole thing over 6. Okay, let's bring that up over on this side. And you'll see that we'll end up getting the same thing, so it's not that big of a deal. But again, just kind of personal preference. So that square root of 9 is 3, and divide that by 6. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to split these things up. All right, so one of my solutions is going to be 9 plus 3 divided by 6, and the other one is going to be 9 minus 3. Divide that by 6. So on the left, that's going to give me 12 divided by 6, which is 2. And on the right, that's going to give me 9 minus 3, right? So that's 6. And 6 divided by 6 is 1. So you see, you still get the same answer. You choose, okay?